So film isn't actually expensive as it could be. Let me explain. In recent years, we've seen film prices fluctuate up and down, much to the disdain of film photographers everywhere. Well, despite this, I've gotten a ton of comments from you guys explaining how when you look at the historical price of film, it's actually not as far from what people had paid in the past. Now, to be fair, I honestly didn't really believe this notion, and it wasn't until I overheard a friend talking about it and how convinced he was that it started to convince me, I guess. With that being said, I've taken some time to do some research to look at some historical prices and compare them to some of the inflated prices we have today and see how they compare. So let's jump into it. For the most part, when initially looking at old catalog listings for film in the 1970s and 80s, and then comparing the number to the inflated prices of everything today, they're honestly quite comparable, but is that actually true? Of course, there is some variety, with prices sometimes fluctuating and being notably higher or lower in any given 6-month period. Also, something to think about is that the overall cost of a camera retail from back then compared to today is significantly lower in cost. A lot of these film cameras retailed for hundreds or thousands of dollars, whereas now you can get them at a fraction of the price, which is comparatively cheap to back then. With that being said, I think there's two main things that people are complaining about when it comes to prices. First, there's definitely an annoyance or shock from the fact that prices have gone up a lot recently in the last handful of years. From the mid-2000s, when digital cameras began to rise, to about 10 years ago, film had been consistently cheaper than any other time period to compare when I was looking at historical prices. Secondly, it's just that the price adds up. People who are into film photography generally like to shoot a lot, I think, and we generally like to own a variety of different film cameras. In comparison, most people who shot film non-professionally back in the day didn't shoot a lot of it and didn't collect multiple high-end cameras. The second part of that is that it seems to add up a lot quicker than just paying a lump sum upfront for a digital camera. When you purchase a new Sony, you pay an upfront cost of $1,000 or whatever, then generally don't have to worry about any costs from there on out once you get the SD card and all the accessories. Whereas with film, you pay maybe the same, but maybe less, like $100 to $200 for a camera, but then have to continually be putting in money to get a return, which again, for many people is just honestly an annoyance. I think this is especially exacerbated when people are paying $20 or more to mail in their film and get scanned and developed. On top of that, to only be getting like 4 or 5 good photos out of the roll, I can see that being very deterring for someone when they're first beginning. To put it blunt, I think we're a bit, maybe not spoiled, but jaded. I think many film photographers, myself definitely included from time to time, get a little woe is me, even though we choose this medium and complain about the prices, even though they might not actually be as bad as we perceive. Also, I think the crazy gear acquisition craze doesn't help, and I certainly play into that. We see all these people owning and shooting a wide variety of different cameras, and we think we need this one and this one for that situation and one for that super niche specific situation that we never actually shoot, but still need that multiple $100 camera for. But to be fair, I play a huge part of this, showing you guys new cameras, making you want to buy new cameras, new lenses, new films, etc. So I think keeping in mind that the money you spent on gear could be used on actual photos is something noteworthy. That being said, people who are shooting film today are doing it as a hobby as opposed to a necessity. So a lot of people like to experiment with different cameras or film, which there's nothing wrong with, but you just have to understand your limits, especially with acquiring new cameras. Because it is a hobby, and at this point in art form, we end up shooting a lot more abstract, more random, everyday scenes and of things compared to our family photo albums, where it's full of birthdays and vacations and not as many random, aesthetically pleasing things. Film was looked way more as a means to an end to capture memories versus a medium for an art form. I also think there's something to be said about the state of the economy, inflation, and people's overall less disposable income towards their hobbies, but I'll save you guys from Photo Man blabbering on about economics. Thankfully, according to a pretty deep dive in an amazing resource by Mike Ekman, we can see just exactly where the price of film today compares to yesteryear's prices, so let's take a look. In 1888, you got the equivalent of 3 36 exposure rolls of black and white film for 83 cents each, which when comparing with inflation comes in at around $24 a roll, significantly more than the current price point we have of quality black and white film. Obviously back then it wasn't actually 35mm, it didn't come in 36 exposures, etc., but you get the point. By the first decade of the 20th century, film use among amateurs and professionals exploded. Like I said earlier, obviously they were using much different formats, most of which did not survive the first half of the 20th century, but of the ones that did, an 8 exposure roll of 127 vest pocket film was 20 cents and a 12 exposure roll of 120 was 40 cents. These prices compare to $5.60 and $11.20 today respectively, which aren't that far off from current single roll prices of film. Kodachrome was then first announced in April 15th of 1935, which was a big deal for photography. For the time, it was the highest quality color film available, and it produced accurate and vibrant colors that ushered in a new era of photography. A lush field of flowers or bright yellow dress could now be seen in full color compared to earlier processes that usually required hand dyes or primitive two-color emulsions. For as pioneering of a film Kodachrome was, it was also very expensive, between $32 to $65 for a single roll in today's money, which, including developing, it was out of reach for all but pretty much just professional photographers. It would take a world war and nearly 2 decades after the release of Kodachrome for prices to come down to a point where the average family snap shooter could afford a roll, and even then it was still expensive. By 1954, photography was getting cheaper, not only for film, but also the cameras that used it. The prices for Kodachrome were $1.88 for an 8 exposure roll of 828 format roll film, $3.50 for a 20 exposure roll of 35mm, and $5.50 for a 36 roll of 35mm film. Developing and slide mounting was included, and when adjusted for inflation, these prices compared to $19.17, $35.69, and $56.09 today. As the decades passed, photography continued to get more affordable. By the 1970s, roll film cameras were used only by professionals, with regular 35mm and Instamatic cameras as the preferred cameras for the average person. The prices of the most popular film ranges from $2.50 to $9.30, which when adjusted for inflation compared to $13.16 and $48.97 today. By the 1980s, there was quite a bigger variety in film, but Kodachrome was still a household name. In an effort to maintain consistency, Mike compares only the Kodachrome and Ektachrome prices, which when adjusted for inflation compared to $12.62 and $20 today. In the April 1995 issue of Popular Photography, the magazine declared this to be the, quote, golden age of color photography, with more options available than ever before. At this point, many of the films that we know today, Gold, Fujicolor, Provia, Velvia, etc., were all available. Something I noticed is that by the mid-1990s, shooting slide film was more expensive than print film, which is the opposite of how it was a few decades earlier. Faster films generally started to cost more too, quite a bit higher as the ISO climbs. It seems the sweet spot for 1 to 200 speed print film is in the $7 to $9 price range, with slide films in the $12 to $14 range, which when adjusted for inflation compares to $12.50 to $16.25 for print film and $21.65 to $25.30 for slide film. Now, something I think is noteworthy is that all the prices we've covered so far are leading up to the digital revolution of photography. Obviously, they quite drastically changed the landscape for photography forever, but how much of an impact on prices did it actually make? For most general color film, a 36 exposure roll of 35mm stays in the range of $1.69 to $3.19 for print film, and anywhere from $5.99 to $11.69 for slide film. These prices, when adjusted for inflation, compared to $2.36 and $4.46 for color print film, and $8.37 to $16.33 for slide film. An extremely affordable time for film, as it was exiting and digital was starting to take over. With all that being said, as of now, a roll of 35mm Kodak Gold is between $7 to $11, which I personally do not think is a bad price for film currently. Now, if you've been shooting film the last 20 years, the constant price hikes, in addition to heavier inflation, can get old, I would imagine, especially compared to the prices of the mid-2000s, but that's also not something exclusive to film, but more so the economy in general. That being said, even when film was in its heyday in the 70s and 80s, it never was a super cheap venture to go down. Like I alluded to earlier, there's a reason why all the photo books from family trees contain photos of birthdays, graduation, kids growing up, etc. It was rarely a commonplace to shoot it haphazardly at random stuff like we do today, as more of an artistic medium versus a mean to an ends for capturing memories. Which I will be the first to agree that film photography is certainly not a cheap hobby to go down to, but by doing a little research, which is super accessible thanks to Mike's blog, we can get some new perspective on the state of film in the modern era and beyond. At this point, film photography is an extremely niche and premium hobby, and that comes with a cost. Let's just be thankful we're not in the 1920s or 30s working as a chimney sweep or something, not being able to afford a camera or shoot film at all. Otherwise, that's going to wrap it up for this one, guys. Let me know down in the comments what you think about this video and what you think about the price of film from 100 years ago to today. I was actually quite surprised to see that film has been quite an expensive venture regardless of when you've shot it. Otherwise, I'm sure as you guys noticed, I switched out the background a little bit. I'm like 90 degrees from the normal filming spot, so let me know what you think of kind of the photo corner as being the backdrop. Otherwise that's going to wrap it up for this one, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Until the next one, stay safe, stay shooting. Peace out and adios.